Okay, today we're going to simplify radicals in the form of square roots. Now we have this square root sheet here. It says the square root of 1 is 1. The reason why the square root of 1 is 1, because 1, this number here, 1 times itself is 1. The square root of 4 equals 2, because 2 times 2 is 4. The square root of 9 is 3, because 3 times itself, 3 times 3 is 9. Square root of 16 equals 4 because 4 times itself is 16. Also, if you don't have the square root of 1 equals 1 up there, you need to put it. Square root of 1 equals 1. Then 5 times itself is 25. 6 times itself is 36. So the square root means what number times itself would equal that product. Well, we start off with this easy problem. The square root of 9, well, the square root of 9 equals 3 because 3 times 3 is 9. So I just put equals 3. That's easy. The square root of 40, okay? Well, 40 is not a perfect square because there's no integer times itself that equals 40, okay? So, here's what you do. You are going to go on a calculator, hit the second key, and then the X second next to that, and put 40, okay? So click equals. That is an irrational decimal. We're not doing decimals today. No decimals allowed. You're going to learn a new way to do this. Okay, it's not as easy as a decimal, but this thing goes on forever. No pattern. What you do is you're going to label this IRR on top of the square root. Then if this is irrational, okay, with the square root of 40 is irrational, meaning it's a decimal that goes on forever. You put a division sign. And you're going to break this up into a product of two square roots. So you're going to put square root times square root. Okay? Square root times square root. Now you're wondering, what's with the division? Well, you're going to punch in 40 divided by, and just leave that empty. Now we want to see if 40 divides by any of these perfect squares. Now you start with the perfect square that is smaller than 40. So these numbers in the square roots, what's the first one that's smaller than 40? It'd be 36. So divide 40 by 36. You got a decimal, so you can't, 40 is not divisible by 36. So you clear it, you hit 40 divided by again. Now work your way up, then you come to 25. Is 40 divisible by 25? No, that's 1.6. I got a decimal, so that doesn't work. Then divide 40 by 16. Got a decimal, 2.5. You can't use it if you get a decimal. 40 divided by 9. You got a decimal, that's not going to work. Now 4. Aha, I did not get a decimal, so I stopped dividing. Now keep that on your calculator. What you do is you put 4 in the first square root, and then your answer you got 10 in the second square root. Now, I want it in that order because the square root of 40 equals the square root of 4 times the square root of 10. 4 times 10 is 40, so yeah, the square root of 4 times the square root of 10 is the square root of 40. Now, you get rid of the square root of 4 because that is equal to an integer. The square root of 4 is 2, okay? So that is your answer. 2 times the square root of 10. So what you do is you just put 2 and then the square root of 10 next to it. You can't multiply those two because this is now an integer. This is a square root number. So you just leave that and that's your answer, 2 square root of 10. Now the square root of 18, okay? The square root of 18 is not on the perfect square list. So again, then I go to my calculator. So that's irrational, IRR. It's not a perfect square, so I do this divided by, and then square root times square root. Okay, so I go 18 divided by. What's the first perfect square I have that's less than 18? It'd be 16. Okay, so we'd start 80 divided by 16. Nope, that's a decimal. 18 divided by again. Go 18 divided by, and now you work your way up to 9. 9 and 2. Now, here's what I see a lot of people do, and it's flat out wrong. They'll put 9 in that square root, but then they'll put the 3 answer in the second. No, okay? You put 9 and 2. The square root of 9 turns into 3, okay? You don't go 9 here and 3 here. That's wrong. You go 9 and 2. because 18 equals 9 times 2. Now, the 3 comes in and replaces the square root of 9, because that's what it's equal to. So 3 times the square root of 2, so we just put 3 square root 2. Okay. Now the square root of the number 30. Okay. Well, 30 is not a perfect square, so since 30 is not a perfect square, you know it's going to be irrational. If that's not on your list, if the square root of 30 is not on the list, okay, you know it's going to be irrational, so you have to do the dividing. So 30, I would start at 25. Is 30 divisible by 25? No, I got a decimal. So I go 30 divided by again, and then 16, I got a decimal. 30 divided by 9, that's a decimal. 30 divided by 4 is a decimal. 30 divided by 1 is going to work. Any integer is divisible by 1. You get 1, so you put 1 and 30. Okay, you don't put 1 and 1. Okay, you put 1 and 30. Now this is going to be a little different. The square root of 1 equals 1. Okay. Now, when you have a coefficient of 1, this is called my coefficient now, okay? When the coefficient is 1, you don't put it, okay? You get rid of it and you just put square root of 30. This was what's known as a prime square root, meaning it just stays the same because the only thing it divides by is 1, okay? So if you end up with a coefficient of 1, you don't put it. But if you end up with a coefficient of 2 or 3, you put it. Okay, 112. Well, 112 is not a perfect square, okay? It's an irrational square root. So you go divided by, and then you make the product of the square roots. So 112 divided by 100 decimal. 81 decimal. 64 decimal. 112 divided by 49 is a decimal. Divided by 36, decimal. 25, decimal. Okay, 16, I didn't get a decimal, so I put 16. You don't go 16 and 4. Quit that. The 16 will turn into 4. You put 16 and 7, okay? Because 16 times 7 is 112. Now the square root of 16 turns into the integer 4. Okay, so we have a coefficient of 4, and then I just put the square root of 7 right next to it. Okay, the square root of 17. Well, 17 is not a perfect square, so we are going to need to label it irrational. Put the division sign, square root times square root. So 17 divided by 16, decimal. 17 divided by 9, decimal. 4 is a decimal. We know it's going to divide by 1, so I put 117. Now the square root of 1 equals 1. Now if the coefficient's 1, you don't put the coefficient in, you just put the square root of 17. I don't want to see the coefficient of 1. Okay, the square root of 75. 75 is not a perfect square. So I know it's going to be irrational, so I put the division sign and then square root times square root. So 75 divided by 64, decimal. 75 divided by 49, decimal. 36, decimal. 75 is finally divisible by 25, but you don't flip and put 25 and 5. The 25 turns into 5. You put the square root of 25 and the square root of 3, and the square root of 25 is replaced with the integer 5. So the coefficient's 5 and the square root is 3. 5 square root 3. Okay, the square root of 300. Now 300, by the way, I know I don't go to 300 on here, but find the square root of 300. And that's irrational, okay? So no decimals. So you put the division and square root times square root. So start at 225. Nope. 300 divided by, go to 196. Nope. 169. Nope. 144. Nope. 121. Nope. Okay, finally we got 103. So you put 103 in the square roots. That's how you fill in the square roots. Now the square root of 100 equals 10. Okay, so it's 10 square root 3. Okay, keep it rolling here. Okay, the square root of 90. Okay, 90, definitely not a perfect square. So I label it irrational. Square root times square root. And then 90 81's a decimal. 64 is a decimal. 49 is a decimal. It's not divisible by 36. It's not divisible by 25. That's our way to 90 divided by 25. No, it's not. Okay, 3.6. 90 divided by 16, decimal. 90 divided by 9 works. So you put 9 and 10, not 9 and 3. Okay, so the square root of 9 is replaced with its integer of 3. So we have 3 times the square root of 10. Integer 3, square root 10. 3 square roots of 10 is what that says. Okay, the square root of 60. So 60 a perfect square? Nope, so we put divided by. It's irrational. You know it's irrational because there's no integer times itself. That's 60. Okay. Okay, so 60 divided by 49, no. 36, no. 25, no. 16, no. 9, no. 4, yes, so you put 4, 15, not 4, 2. The 4 turns into 2, or 4 and 15, okay? So the square root of 4 turns into 2, because that has an integer value, and you have coefficient 2, square root 15. Okay, now the square root of 100, well, 100's on the list, okay? This is not irrational, okay? So I don't want to see the division sign in the 2 square roots, because you see, when the number's actually on the list, you just put, you don't put IRR, it's not irrational, okay? 100 is a perfect square. So you don't put the division sign and start dividing. You just put 10. You put the IRR label if it's not a perfect square, okay? 7, 7 again. Now 7's not on the list, so I'm back to the IRR. So divided by. So 7, you'd start with 4, nope, then 1. Okay, 1 and 7. So the square root of 1's 1, but when you have a coefficient of 1, you just leave it as the square root of 7. So this was a prime square root. Okay, I don't want to see the coefficient of 1. The square root of the number 80. Okay, 80 is not a perfect square, meaning it would be irrational square root. So we need to divide and write it into 2 square roots. So 80 divided by 64 is a decimal. 49 is a decimal. 36 decimal. 25 is a decimal. 16, finally we got it to work. So 16 and 5. Now you replace the square root of 16 with its equal of 4. So we have coefficient 4, square root 5. Now 81. Oh, 81's a perfect square, so don't put IR, don't start dividing, just put what the thing equals. It's equal to the integer 9. There's no square root remaining, okay? The square root's like your remainder when it's not a perfect square. Square root of 35, okay? Not seeing 35, so that's irrational. IRR divided by. So 35, you'd start with 25 because that's the first number that's smallest. decimal, 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 and then it's divisible by 1, 1, and 35. Now if the coefficient's 1, okay, you don't put that, you just put square root of 35. Okay, square root of 24, so 24 is not a perfect square, so that's irrational. Okay, so you put divided by, meaning there's no number times itself, no integer times itself, that would actually be just right on 24. So 24 divided by 16 decimal, 9 decimal, and then 24 divided by 4. But you don't put 4 and 2, you put 4 and 6, and then the square root of 4 is replaced with its value of 2. Okay, so 2 square root 6. Coefficient 2 square root 6.